So I think this whole part is about, this section was about suffering.
Yeah. Well, about a certain kind of suffering. He wants to deal with the issue. You see, as a work of apologetics, as a book that falls into the category of apologetics, what he's doing is he's engaging in an argument with the critics of religion in general and Christianity in particular. So he looks at the arguments that are put forth by authors who want to suggest that religion is a force for violence and war and all kinds of upheavals throughout history. What he does is he goes through the main arguments that are used by atheist authors against both Christianity and oftentimes Islam will be included in that. They look at some of the historical conflicts that are associated with Christianity and Islam, and they use that as an argument to suggest that religion is a force for evil instead of a force for good. Now, just to give you an example of a group of people who believe the opposite, when you go back and you read the letters and the documents and some of the writings of the founders of America, for example, George Washington's farewell address after he left office, he knew that in a democracy, you don't have a guiding ideological principle that shapes your conscience, because the First Amendment to the Constitution says that your conscience is free, and that government has no business telling you what you should believe and not believe, what your values should be, your morality and all of that. That's a personal matter that government should stay out of. So in his farewell address to the American people, George Washington said that what would shape the conscience of Americans and keep America a country that had high moral standards, he left that up to the church and Christian commitments. That's what he believed would hold our society together and shape our conscience and keep us from becoming a people that would be torn apart. Okay, so on the one hand, you have the argument that religion is a force for good, and that's one example of it. And on the other hand, you have people who think religion is a force for evil. Now, what D'Souza does is he looks at those events, those historical events that are cited as examples of how religion has been a source of evil. And he looks at the details, the historical details of those events, and suggests that, in fact, religion, while it has at times been a force for extremism and even violence, okay, that nevertheless, over and against regimes that were self-consciously atheist and anti-religious, that the crimes of religion don't in any way, shape, or form reach the level of evil that atheist regimes do. Okay, that's his overall argument. Okay, now he starts with two typical events that are cited as examples of how Christianity went wrong. Now, before I get into those events, I want to say something about Christianity's founding documents. In other words, the New Testament. Okay? If you read the letters of Paul, what you will find is that at the end of each letter, and most of the time, Paul wrote letters because the churches he was writing to had questions about, Christian faith, and there were conflicts within the congregation, and he was addressing those in his letters. At the end of all of his letters, Paul writes a series of what are called exhortations. Exhortations were Paul's way of encouraging people to live according to Christian values and moral standards. Now, a perfect example of that, I included in my devotional for this week, my Lenten devotional on entitled Our Thirst for God. At the end of that devotional, I read sections of chapter 12 of Romans where Paul gives a series of exhortations where he tells the people to love one another, to care for the sick and the poor, not to return evil for evil, and even if your enemies are in need, help them out. He's got all these moral and virtuous standards for Christians to live up to. Okay. Now the question is, has the Christian church always lived up to its own moral standards? And I don't have to tell you what the moral standards of Jesus were, because I assume you all know that from having come to church, Sunday school, and reading the Gospels. You know that his foundational message was a message of divine love, forgiveness, mercy, and that human beings, having been forgiven, should in turn forgive others and love others just as we have been loved. Okay, so the virtues that Christianity teaches are as clear as crystal. And it's a high bar. It's a high standard. In fact, it's a standard that none of us live up to. We just don't have the ability to always live up to standards like love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I mean, that's a standard that is a little difficult for human nature to live up to. Okay, so with that in mind, the institutional church has not always also lived up to its own foundational documents and standards. two historical factors were included in his discussion. The first is the Crusades. How many of you are familiar with the Crusades? Yeah, okay. So the accusation is that Christian crusaders, that the Crusades represented a period of time when Christians were, committing acts of evil against other people. All right. So, but here's the context of the Crusades. There's a couple of things you have to know to put them in perspective. First of all, the Middle East, that includes what is now called Iraq, Syria, Palestine, which is both Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and Egypt, were up until the 7th century totally Christian. Aside from a few Jews who lived there, even Persia, which is now Iran, was Christian in those days. So what happened? How did Iran and Iraq and Syria and Palestine and Egypt, how did they become Muslim when they in fact were for centuries Christian? Well, what happened is that after Muhammad died, his followers, and Muhammad is credited with uniting all of the Arab tribes. The Arab tribes in what is now Saudi Arabia were, before Muhammad, they were fighting with each other. There was a lot of tribalism. And Muhammad united all of those Arab tribes. And he called on the new Muslim country, which Mecca was the center of. He called on them to convert people all over the globe. So Muslim armies moved in the 7th century. This is the end of the 600s, okay, came through all of those areas that were Christian and forcefully converted that whole area. In fact, the Muslim armies even at one point had taken possession of parts of Italy and most of Spain. Okay, so in the 11th century, the Christian countries of Western Europe were faced with the threat that they were going to be completely overrun and that the whole of Europe would become Muslim, right? So Pope, I think it was a Pope who took the name of Pius, Pope Pius the something, he called for the Christian nations, which included the old Holy Roman Empire, which is now Germany, France, and Britain, and parts of Italy. He called on all the Christian nations to fight back, to stop the advance of Muslim conquest. And so the Christians did two things. The first thing they did, and this was under the same Holy Roman Emperor that convicted Martin Luther. His name was Charles, I think the Fifth or something. Anyway, he raised an army and he stopped the Muslim group at the gates of the city of Vienna. A war took place, and Charles prevailed, and at that point, the Muslim incursion into Europe began to wane, okay, and weaken. But then they also called for Christians to retake the Holy Land. Now, the reason they wanted to retake the Holy Land was because Christians wanted to make pilgrimages to the places that are named in the Bible, right? So they wanted to go to Jerusalem. They wanted to go to Galilee, where Jesus was. They wanted to go to all those places that they read about in the Bible, and make a religious pilgrimage. So what the Crusades were was an attempt on the part of Christian nations, and it's important to understand that the Crusaders themselves were volunteers. Okay, they weren't a formal army like we have a military with the Pentagon and an army of that is formally organized and under the authority of the government. It wasn't like that. This was just volunteers who packed their own horses or pack animals and brought their own provisions. They gathered together and they tried to retake what we call the Holy Land, so the Christians could make pilgrimages there. Now, in 1099, they were actually successful. And for about 5 or 6 decades, they called Palestine, with Jerusalem as the capital, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And it was under the authority of, of a Christian bishop. But after about 5 or 6 centuries, a Muslim ruler by the name of Saladin decided he was going to retake Palestine for the Muslims, because Palestine, and Jerusalem in particular, is holy not only for Christians and Jews, but for Muslims too, which is why there's so much controversy surrounding the city of Jerusalem. It's a holy place for all 3 religions. And on the Temple Mount in particular, it was from the Temple Mount that Muslims believe Muhammad made his night journey up to heaven, where he encountered Moses. So, it's a place that is invested with so much symbolic significance. It's the place where Jesus was crucified and rose again, where Muhammad went to heaven, and where the Jews had their temple for centuries. So that's what the Crusades were. Now, the Crusaders, it is true that when they traveled from Europe to Palestine, they did, in fact, commit crimes against a lot of people along the way. Because the fact of the matter is that they didn't have food to bring with them. They needed to somehow find the provisions necessary to stay alive during this crusade. So the Crusaders, they stole and they pillaged and they committed a lot of evil acts along the way in order to get provisions for themselves. But it's important to understand that the Crusaders' motive was not to kill and pillage. That was not their motive. Their motive was to retake the Holy Land so Christians could make pilgrimages. Okay, is everybody following what I'm saying so far? Okay, all right. And like I say, Saladin had raised an army, a Muslim army, and there was a big battle up in Galilee near Nazareth, of all places, where Jesus was born. There was a big battle between the Crusaders and the Muslims won. And the Crusaders had to go home, and that was the end of that. And they retook Jerusalem. Okay, so now a lot of people who, for whatever reason, are critics of Christianity, raise the issue of the Crusades as an example of why they think religion is a force for evil rather than good, because of what the Crusaders did. Okay, so I'm not gonna try and justify the Crusades or in any way suggest that what they were doing was a good thing, because it wasn't. But it is important to understand that their motive was not to commit evil acts. Their motive was to take a place they considered holy. All right. And the Muslims had the same motive, right? When they moved through the Middle East, through Iraq and Syria and Egypt, and forced conversions on the entire population, their motive was to convert people to Islam, because they considered anybody who was not a Muslim to be an infidel. And like I say, they made it all the way to Spain and parts of Italy. All right, so that's the Crusades. It's not, they're not, they're not an admirable part of Christian history. We have to admit that the Crusades were not a good thing. But it's important to understand that they were no different from the people that they were fighting against. Okay, so when you put it in perspective, it's not like the Crusades represent a specific way in which you can condemn Christianity for evil acts, because their motives were no different than the motives of the Muslims, who also wanted to be in possession of the Holy Land. All right, so that's the Crusades. The other thing he mentions is the Inquisition. How many of you are familiar with the Inquisition? Okay, the Inquisition, the Inquisition took place in Spain. Okay, eventually the Christian armies expelled the Muslims from Spain. And King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, who were the king and queen that sent Columbus, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, off to find a shorter route to India. He ends up in North America and calls the natives here Indians, right? That's how they got their name, Indians. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella wanted Spain to be a pure Roman Catholic country. So they initiated a religious court, which was called the Inquisition. And the guy in charge of that was called the Grand Inquisitor, the top judge, like the Supreme Court. And what the Inquisition did, for the most part, okay, number one, there were what you might call crimes, I guess, against the Jews, because Ferdinand and Isabella told the Jewish population in Spain that they either had to convert or leave, one of the two. Okay, some Jews pretended to convert so that they could stay. They didn't really convert, but they pretended to so that they could stay. Okay, so there was that. That was not good. That was not good. But the Jews, they were persecuted in virtually every country where they lived, which is why after World War II, and in light of the Holocaust, which we'll get to in a minute here, which is why the Jewish people finally decided that they had to have a country of their own for their own protection. Because wherever else they lived, aside from the United States, okay, Jews lived peacefully in this country. But there was anti-Semitism in America too. I mean, there was examples of anti-Semitism here, just like everywhere else. So they believed they had to have a country of their own. But the Jews that established the modern state of Israel were not religious Jews. They didn't do it for religious reasons. They were secular Jews. And they saw Palestine as their ancestral land. It wasn't that they believed God gave them this land, therefore, they should be able to have it. It was that this was their ancestral land. This is where their ancestors all came from. So they had a connection to that land. This is, just like all of us feel a connection to the place where we came from. Okay, so there was the expelling of Jews during the Inquisition. So that was one thing. The other thing was Christians who were believed to be heretics. In other words, people who taught false doctrines. Most of them were not powerful people who had a lot of influence on others. They were just, oddballs who believed crazy things. Okay, so the inquisitors, they didn't torture these people, most of them, and they didn't murder most of them. What they did was they prescribed the normal kinds of penance that medieval Christians believed in. So they had to say the rosary, or they had to, what we would call today do community service. They had to go out and do good works. In other words, they had to atone for their heretical beliefs and reestablish their orthodoxy. In other words, that they believed the orthodox doctrines of the Christian church. That's what most of the Inquisition was. Now, there were instances where the Inquisition did, in fact, sentence people to death. I'm not familiar enough with the Inquisition to know who those people were or why the inquisitors felt that they needed to be, put to death. I can't give you that kind of information. But I can tell you that there were a number of people who were, because they were considered heretics, were put to death. Okay, so that's another instance in Christian history that we're not proud of. It happened, and we just have to deal with the fact that Christians have not always lived up to their moral, foundation. Okay. All right. Now, before I move on from there, does anybody have any questions about either of those two events, the Crusades or the Inquisition? Okay. Now, in the next chapter, what de Souza does is take a look at regimes that were not religious, but were explicitly atheist, and at the crimes that they committed, all right, and why they did it. Specifically, he looks at Stalinist Russia, he looks at Nazi Germany, and he looks at communist China under Mao Zedong. China has radically changed since Mao Zedong died. They don't do what they did under him anymore. It's a different place. But under Mao Zedong, there were probably more mass murders under Mao Zedong than under any other tyrant in history. The estimates are close to 20 million people that were put to death, okay? Especially during what was called the Chinese Cultural Revolution. That was Mao's attempt to establish communist principles in Chinese society. Okay, so according to Marxist theory, the way this is supposed to work is that the common working people are supposed to rise up and defeat their capitalist overlords, get rid of them, and then they will own the means of production and they will be free, right? So what Mao Zedong did is he instigated something like the Inquisition. And anybody who was convicted of being suspicious of not living according to orthodox communist doctrines, was put to death. And there were millions of those. Millions. And it was not until, do you remember when Richard Nixon went to China? For the first time, you know, a foreign leader went to China, right? And who did he meet with? He met with a guy named Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping took over as the premier. I don't know what they called him, you know, at that time, but he was kind of the leader of the Communist Party after Mao Zedong finally died. And he completely changed Chinese society. Under Mao Zedong, China remained an impoverished country, like North Korea is an impoverished country. There was mass starvations. There was, you know, there's not enough cultivatable land in China to produce the food they need for that gigantic population that they have. So there was a terrible problem of lack of food and starvation. So what Deng Xiaoping does is he introduces capitalism into China. And you can see what it's done to China, right? I mean, what's happened? Multinational corporations have moved all of their manufacturing to China because it's cheap labor. If you have an Apple product, it was made in China. Just about everything you buy at places like Target or Walmart or Costco, that stuff is all made in China, right? Because okay, so that's how China was able to build a strong and growing economy that got their people out of poverty. But of course, it's not the kind of capitalism that America has, at least that it has now. That could change. But in China, any incorporated enterprise like Huawei or whatever corporation we're talking about has to have at least 51% ownership by the Communist Party, so that the Communist Party still has control over all of these these capitalist enterprises. So it's kind of a modified form of communism. It's a mixture of communism and capitalism. Okay, so D'Souza lists Mao Zedong's, you know, his cultural revolution, where millions of people were put to death, as an example of how an atheist regime, explicitly atheist regime, because according to Karl Marx, remember, Karl Marx believed that the reason workers didn't rise up and take control of the capitalist enterprise, throw the people with all the money out and take control of the companies. Marx believed the reason they didn't do that was because of religion. He called religion the opiate of the people. In other words, his point of view was that common people are willing to suffer under unfair working conditions. Okay, remember Marxism came about during the Industrial Revolution. So there were big factories and with lots of workers. The working conditions were unsafe. They were hiring children to work long hours. They were paying their workers poverty wages. I mean, it was a really terrible what was going on. So it's it's no wonder that somebody like Karl Marx would come along and say this can't, this system has got to change.
Yeah.
But he believed that people put up with the system and suffered this terrible life they lived because they hoped for a better life after death. So from his point of view, religion was a force for evil because it kept people hoping for a better life after death while they were exploited in this life. Okay, so that's the theory. So communist regimes are inherently atheist. Now, how did that work itself out? Now, of course, the first communist revolution occurred in Russia during World War I. Okay, Lenin was in charge, and there was a guy named Trotsky and a bunch of others. And eventually Stalin took over, okay? So what happened in Russia is that what should have been, according to the Marxist theory, what should have been a system where the common people actually owned the means of production and their lives were made better, actually the opposite took place. The government owned the means of production, and the government controlled what people could do. So there were times when the government would exploit people for self-centered reasons. Stalin in particular, he was a paranoid guy. He would have these show trials of people he just didn't like, and he would have them, he would have a show trial. There would always be one of these, these mirrors where you can, in a room next to the trial room, you can see through, but you can't see from the trial room there. So he could observe what was going on, and they didn't know he was there. He made sure that the outcome of the trial was the way he wanted it. Which was guilty firing squad. I don't know all of the ways in which Stalin committed genocide, but I know some of them. One of them was the gulags that Alexander Solzhenitsyn talked about in his book, The Gulag Archipelago. I'm not sure why people were sent to these gulags and who these people were. I do know that the Russian Orthodox Church was basically shut down. I mean, it went underground. They couldn't destroy it, the pious people, the pious Russian Orthodox people just went underground, okay? But people who were the priests, Stalin would have them put in an airplane. The airplane would go up, right? And they'd be pushed out.
Oh.
And that would be the end of that. Okay. So if you were a priest, you were executed. The other big crime he committed was done because those of you who know something about World War II might remember that in the late 1930s, Hitler sent a huge army into Russia. He wanted to conquer Russia just as he had conquered Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, France. Hitler had control of all of Europe with the exception of Britain, thanks to Winston Churchill. Okay, so and the U.S. wasn't in the war yet. Americans didn't want to get involved in a European war. They remembered World War I and the horrible things that went on there, so Americans wanted to stay out of this thing. But in any case, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. And, well, I mean, it wasn't the Soviet Union, it was just Russia. And he made it all the way to Moscow. Millions and millions of people were killed in that war, both German and Russian. Now, what happened as a result of that is that the Russian farmers couldn't produce any food to feed the Russian people because the Germans were occupying too much of that land. So there was the possibility of starvation in Russia during this war. So what Stalin did is he absconded all the crops that were grown in the Ukraine, most Americans don't know much about Ukrainia, except that Donald Trump made a call there. Remember that? Okay. And he was almost impeached for that call. All right. But what Stalin did is he took all the crops that were raised in the Ukraine, because Ukrainia is a little bit like the American Midwest. It's flat, fertile ground that's farmed, mass farms. And as a result of Stalin absconding with the crops from Ukrainia, there was mass starvation in the Ukraine. Millions of people died. Okay, so I see I'm running just about out of time here. The third one, big one that he mentions here, of course, is Hitler. Some people think Hitler coexisted with the Christian church. That is not true. Anybody who knows anything about Dietrich Bonhoeffer knows that Christians and Nazis could not coexist. Hitler believed, okay, so Hitler's motivation was not political, it was racial. He believed that the Aryan race was superior to all other races, and that the Jews in particular were a subhuman race, along with disabled people, people with mental illness, homosexuals, you know, the sick, the weak, you know, all of these people ended up in Hitler's mass murder camps, Auschwitz and all of those places. Okay, but his motivation was not Christian, it was anti-Christian. He had this belief in the master race. Okay, here's what I want to leave you with. Okay, his argument at the end of chapter 19, he quotes the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky on page 278.
Mhm.
Dostoevsky said, "If God is not, everything is permitted." In other words, if your conscience is not accountable to a higher authority of some kind, then you can concoct any ideology you want and use that as your own personal religion to justify, you know, any form of evil. And that's what Mao Zedong did, that's what Stalin did, and that's what Hitler did. All right? So his argument is that when you compare the relative to these three regimes, the crimes that the Christian church committed during the Crusades and the Inquisition, when you compare those to what these three regimes did, you know, it's like comparing the size of a mouse to an elephant. So his ultimate argument is, again, the same argument that George Washington had in his farewell address, and that is that the practical value of the institutional church is to teach values and a moral foundation that will keep people from falling into patterns of behavior that are ultimately evil.
I have a question.
Sure.
Did D'Souza consider atheism to be a religion or no? No?
Yes.
Oh, he did?
Anything that you believe is the ultimate meaning of life is your religion.
Mhm.
Okay, so if you are not an adherent of one of the traditional religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, if you don't belong to any of those, you're gonna create a religion, and usually that religion is going to be some form of political ideology,
Okay.
which is happening in America today.
Mhm. Yes.
Hey, we're going to move to the next chapter we're going to study is chapter 20, the moral foundations. Let's see. Yeah, I think we can do chapter 20 and chapter 21.
Okay,
Thank you all for joining me today. Appreciate it. And thank you, Judy, for hosting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good.
Okay.
Good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.